Welcome to the Vets Talking Pets podcast. From scales to tails, real talk with real vets. No pet subject is off limits. With your hosts, Dr. Maggie Roberts and Dr. Vanessa Howie.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Vets Talking Pets with Dr. Maggie Roberts and Dr. Vanessa Howie. So in the last podcast we talked about what you need to consider before getting a pet. And today we're going to look more into which pet should you get if you're considering getting one.
So we thought we'd just sort of run through the common pets, just to talk a little bit about the pros and cons. Again, we will probably in future podcasts talk a little bit more, particularly about things like what breeds to choose. But I mean, at the moment, I'm not sure whether there's more dogs or more cats in the UK. It seems to vary. There's similar numbers. I think there's probably slightly more dogs at the moment. I think
slightly more dogs still as a result of the COVID boom.
Yeah, because I think there was something that had come out of Dogs Trust quite recently that said there was something like 13 million dogs. Ooh. And I think it's 11 million and something of cats. So, but they're usually fairly equal in numbers. But we're going to start off with dogs, and I have never owned a dog.
Have you not?
Never. We were never allowed them when I was a child.
I didn't know that.
I really wanted a dog, but my parents said no because it was too much of a tie. And I don't know, because I go away quite a lot, I'm out quite a lot. I'm not sure that a dog really would suit me, and obviously I do really like cats, but you've got a dog and a cat.
Yeah, I have, and I have to say we waited a long time. I did grow up with a dog at home, but we had two cats before we got a dog, and actually our cats were very established in our household, and by the age of 15 we sadly lost one of them. They were siblings, but then the second one went on to live to the age of 20, and we felt we couldn't introduce a dog to the household until she had passed away, so we waited 20 years before we got a dog. Yeah, crazy. Now we have one, and I have to, we kind of definitely put a lot of consideration into it and decided whether we knew the dog was going to be a big tie, and actually could we cope with him. And I have to say he is a big tie, we wouldn't be without him, but having talked to other friends who before we'll call him Stanley because that's what he's called before we got
he's
Stanley.
Lovely. He really is a gorgeous dog.
A couple of friends said that they loved their dogs, but if they'd have realised how much of a tie they were, they would never have got them in the first place, which I think just shows it's a massive commitment, isn't it, Maggie?
It is, and I think I'm too lazy probably, but I think at least I'm honest enough with myself about it. They are a big tie, and they need a lot of exercise. And like every dog needs exercise, sometimes people think if they have a small breed, what the technical term professionally is a handbag dog, but when they're sort of carrying and barely letting their feet touch the ground, that's not good for dogs. All of them, even the small dogs, need exercise, and they need training. They need grooming, they need lots of mental stimulation, so it really is a tie. And
I think that's it, isn't saying about the exercise, even if they don't necessarily need physical exercise every day, they still do need that mental stimulation, so they need some exercise in some form. So you need to be able to give your time and effort, I suppose, into helping those dogs be stimulated. So it is a time commitment.
It really is. And obviously there's things like vet care, and obviously the bigger the breed, generally the more that's going to cost, because there's more drugs that have to be used, etc.
I think it's always worth remembering, isn't it? The bigger the dog, they eat more food as well. Yes. So food costs a lot more than what my little Stanley will eat. Well as antibiotics, if they ever need antibiotics. Oh my goodness, you have to give these massive big pills for big dogs, whereas you give the little ones for little dogs.
If you've got a 60-70 kilo Irish Wolfhound or whatever, they're probably even more, aren't they? 80 kilos.
80 kilos.
Then you need a lot more antibiotics than if you've got your little sort of 3 kilo Chihuahua, which probably you're never going to get the terminus into a little Chihuahua anyway. But yeah, but obviously, there's loads of positives to having a dog. I still really love dogs. So yeah, they are loyal, aren't they? I mean,
they're really loyal. It's that
yeah,
unconditional love that I mentioned earlier. They
yes,
certainly give. They give a lot of it, and it's lovely.
yeah,
Someone said recently to me, or I read somewhere, that you are your dog's world. Your dog might not be your world because you've got lots of other
yeah,
things going on, but your dog, you are their world. And I think we always need to remember that, because that unconditional love they give is because they are waiting for you to come home. They are waiting for attention from you. So
yeah.
you really are their world. So you've got to be prepared, I suppose, for that level of involvement and need as well, I think, from your dog.
And obviously dogs are a very social species, and I mean, we won't at the moment go into the whole thing about packs and whatever, but they certainly live in sort of family groups in the wild, don't they? And they are really good at communicating with each other, and they understand us. I know people say, oh, but he knows every word I say. They do actually. They can interpret our facial expressions, so they really do understand us. So,
and that's it with dogs. They don't necessarily need another dog. They need a social group.
Yes.
So actually the family, the humans within that become their social group. So it is really important to them.
And, and you may need to, as we've mentioned before, get doggy daycare or whatever. But I sometimes think if the dog spends all its time away with other people, then was that the right pet? But there's lots of really positive things, and it does get you out walking.
It does. It really does, and I think that's the other thing to remember. You need to be out in all weathers.
Yes.
As well. Although I've got a fair weather dog, so we do open the door, and he goes, "No, it's raining. We'll stay in today." So, I think that certainly we talked about exercise before, but yeah, they generally do need to go out, and particularly depends where you're living. I suppose the other thing to mention, isn't it? Because they still need to toilet, so if you're going to have to take them out to go to the toilet, for example, if you're in an apartment or something, it's a bit different from if you live in a house with a big garden where you can let them out to go and do things in their own garden. So it's important to remember what you've got around you and that you'll need to get out with them. So I suppose that leads us on to cats, really, doesn't it? So they're quite a different species to dogs, aren't they, Maggie?
They really are, and there's a vet phrase, cats are not small dogs.
That's very true.
And it's very true. They are very, very different. I think they're really fascinating, and that's because they're actually really hard to understand. They're much more independent.
They're so independent. They're so their own being. They really are.
They really are. I always say they're anarchists, or they would be. Absolutely. They're all about themselves. They've evolved from a solitary species, a solitary hunter, and so they don't have the need for contact with their own species, or they don't actually need contact with us, although obviously as we've sort of selectively bred them, some cats are more attached to us. And I know my cat really loves me. He doesn't really like anybody else, but if I've been away for a couple of days, he is really excited to see me and keeps sort of coming back to see I'm still there. But they are much more independent, so I think they're much more difficult to understand than dogs. And obviously, I think they're very beautiful, they're fascinating, but obviously there are things that sometimes people see as negatives about cats. One of them is predation or hunting, and actually we're recording this at Vanessa's house, and in the time that I've been here, there have been 2 small rodents that have been killed by nutmeg. And my cat Ross, he was crunching something in the middle of the night the other night.
You regularly get visitors on your bed, don't you, in your bedroom, Maggie?
Yeah. I even once thought that there was it was my furry slipper, but it was actually a dead squirrel in my bedroom. And cats are programmed to hunt, so they're not being evil or mean or anything, but particularly if you've got a cat that goes outside, then they will hunt. And so I think you've just got to be prepared for that. And yes, there are things you can do to try and decrease it, but it is something to really think about. And cats generally are cheaper in terms of the everyday costs than dogs, but they do need certain resources, and it's really important that they're placed in the right place. And we're talking about things like litter trays, where you put their food bowl, where you put their water bowl, which is not next to each other. They need different beds because they don't want to sleep in the same place all the time.
I think a note on that is they might not always use the bed you buy as well, I think, isn't it?
I have many unused beds, or beds that have been slept in once. They like to rotate their sleeping places to stop a build-up of parasites, but sometimes they just don't like what you've bought. It doesn't smell right or whatever. And if you have more than one cat, then you need to make sure you've got enough resources for the cats to live separate lives, because some cats don't particularly want to be in the house together. But again, there's a whole other podcast about that. But as we were saying about dogs and mental stimulation, it's important that we have interactive play with our cats. So again, you do need to spend time with them. And especially if you've got an indoor cat, then actually it is more work. You've got more in the way of litter trays. You've got to do more playing. If you've got a long-haired cat, they'll need to be groomed. You need to think about vet care. So there's lots of pros about cats. They probably are easier pets on the whole than dogs, but there's still a lot to think about.
Yeah, and I think just also thinking about, I know we talked earlier about the costs of going away and things like that. It's, although they probably need less time during the day than you would with a dog, and they can be left for longer, you have still got those ongoing issues of actually who will look after my cat, because you can't just go away for a week and leave an automatic feeder out for the cats. No. It's really important that actually that's not something you can do. So you do need provisions in place.
You do, and I think you need somebody to be looking at them at least once in every 24 hours.
Yeah, definitely.
And then I suppose after cats, probably the next most popular pet is probably a rabbit, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is. And I think rabbits, they're not actually as easy as maybe people think they are to keep. Rabbits themselves, they need a lot of space. So you might have you might choose to have an indoor rabbit, or you could actually keep your rabbit outside in a hutch. But ideally, we want to see them eating grass or hay. So how are we going to provide that? They need to live with another bunny. They're not a solitary creature either. You don't see rabbits out in the wild on their own, do you, hopping around the field?
No, they're in colonies, which are usually sort of related, aren't they?
Yeah.
But it's really important that you don't have single rabbits. And I know the Rabbit Welfare Trust, they had a saying, a hutch is not enough. They need a run. They need lots of space, because if you watch rabbits in the wild, they'll stand up on their hind legs. So you need something that's sort of tall enough. They need to be able to hop. I once had a lovely client who actually built what was in effect a warren in her garden, and they had all sorts of tunnels to go through, which was fantastic. But they do need a real opportunity to exercise and to interact both with their own species, and that's really important, and with people as well. And I always used to think as a vet they weren't great patients. No, they seem to sort of be quite good at dying.
Yeah, they don't really cope with the stress, do they? So they're a flight creature, aren't they? So they're a prey species, and I think that's probably the big difference that we're talking about here. Dogs and cats are predators, though cats are predators prey, but we don't have, apart from dogs, I suppose, any other predators for cats currently in the UK.
No, but it is different if you've got a prey species, that they tend to sort of get stressed quite easily, and that they're not. I never felt they were very resilient animals, really.
No,
and they need a lot more vet care than people think, because they can get problems with their teeth, can't they? I mean, we used to see that lots in practice.
Again, we can talk about rabbits a bit, or maybe on another podcast, but talking about what food we should be feeding them, because
getting them neutered, which people don't always realise you can get them neutered, but particularly if you've got several, that's really important. Parasite control, etc. So I think rabbits are something where people think often they're a good pet for children, but I'm not convinced they really are.
No. And it's that whole cleaning out the hutch. Did we talk about that before? Because actually,
that's a lot of work.
If it's one of your children that want you to get your rabbits, they don't ever believe that they'll continue to clean out the hutch.
Yes, yes. However much children say, but I'll clean it out, the vast majority of them don't. And obviously, if you've got an outside hutch and it's raining, it's still got to be cleaned out. So it's certainly, it's not a pet I would rush into.
No, and I think growing up with children, we had rabbits, but we fell down that trap of acquiring a rabbit that hadn't been sexed correctly. Yeah. So we thought we had 2 girls and we had a boy and a girl.
Oh, so you had more bunnies.
Lots of baby bunnies. So,
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it?
It is tricky. It's trickier than you think, I think.
And then there are all the other, professional term, small fairies. Guinea pigs. I mean, I think guinea pigs are probably better pets than rabbits. You've got guineas, haven't you? And I've had guineas as well. I mean, I think they're really lovely pets.
They are. We've got 3 guinea pigs, but they live out for most of the year until the weather gets bad. So they've got a hutch and a run, and likewise they're out during the day in their run eating grass. But again, they're a much better pet, I think, personally, for children. Definitely, they are much more robust.
They are much more robust. Yes, you do need to have more than one. I didn't fall into a trap. I ended up with a guinea pig because of circumstances, from somewhere where it wasn't being looked after very well. But then, of course, I then had to acquire another guinea pig because she couldn't be on her own. And then, of course, the original one died, and you get into that cycle. So I ended up actually finding another home for the single one. But they are a very social species. They really do need the companionship of their own species. And but they are definitely hardier, and they've got a sort of, I suppose, moderate lifespan. I mean, rabbits on average live to be about 7 or 8, and guinea pigs a little bit less.
Yeah, 6-ish. I think 5 or 6. We certainly had. I know we're on round 3 of that, getting new guinea pigs because a guinea pig has died. But I know certainly, when I was a child, we also had a guinea pig. We kept it with a rabbit, which was obviously we wouldn't be doing that now. We wouldn't be advising that that's done. But certainly that guinea pig lived till 8, which is the same age as me when the guinea pig died.
Wow. So, obviously well looked after.
And hamsters.
Then, we get on to the even smaller pets. Hamsters. I mean, I don't think hamsters are very good pets. They're nocturnal, which means they're not very entertaining because they're asleep during the day. And then, particularly if you've got it in someone's bedroom, then they're on the wheel at night. But actually as well, I think they don't particularly like being handled most of the time. And I think if you're getting
woken up when you're meant to be asleep, I think I'd be a bit nippy to be honest.
Yes, absolutely. And I think
a bit crotchety.
A lot of them, are not getting enough mental stimulation. They're just spending all their time in a little cage, a lot of the time, with no interaction. So they do nip a lot. I suppose people see them as being cheap and they have a short lifespan. But I don't think they're brilliant pets, and certainly as vets, they were quite difficult patients.
They can be quite difficult.
Yeah, and just biting quite a lot.
Yes, you have to.
But and then gerbils that obviously they're quite similar to hamsters, but they're not nocturnal. They're more what we would call crepuscular, which is active, sort of dawn and dusk. I think they're a little bit easier to handle, but again, and they really need to bury a lot, don't they, and sort of dig around. So, because, I mean, Jerry, the gerbil we had as a child, I just think didn't probably have a very great life because he didn't, at the time, he just bought a cage. But, I mean, I have seen some gerbils where people have really, really deep
ones,
sort of, I was going to say litter, but it's sort of...
It's like a sandy
sort of sandy stuff. So because they are desert rats, aren't they? And they like to bury, and so they've actually got a depth to bury in. So
they're really good at jumping and getting up high as well.
They're really good at jumping, and you've got to be able to let them do those things. So again, not always easy. I think if you're going to go for one of the smaller rodent species, rats would definitely be my preference.
Yeah, I think rats are really good pets.
They're really good pets. They're very intelligent. I would say they're easier to handle, and you don't really get bitten anything like as much by rats. And yeah, you definitely can really interact with them. And I think people sometimes think, oh, rats, and they think about wild rats carrying plague and things like that. But actually, I think of the small furry pets. They're probably the best. Obviously, they do still have a short lifespan. Things like hamsters, gerbils, rats. It's usually about 2 years, isn't it, at maximum? And rats tend to get a lot of lumps and bumps.
They do. I was just going to say that they're a bit prone to some tumours.
Yeah. But I think they make better pets, and you can take them out of the cage and interact with them much more. Yeah. So
one of my housemates at uni had 2 rats, and actually they were always out of their enclosure. They were always sitting on the sofa and crawling around the sofa, scurrying around with us. So yeah, they are. They are really clever.
They are, and I suppose there's other forms of small furries, and I suppose another one which is. Quite a common pet are things like ferrets.
Yeah.
And actually then you can really interact with ferrets, and they can be really interesting pets. They do smell.
I was just about to say they're a bit stinky.
That actually, if you have them in the house all the time, a lot of people have a shed that they keep them in. But I know a lot of people who've been very, very attached to their ferrets, and they can have some reproductive problems, can't they? Some hormone problems, but they're intelligent, and obviously sometimes people have them as working ferrets.
I do like ferrets; they're nice.
Oh, I like ferrets. I've treated some really lovely ones, I think you need to really understand them and know what they're,
And I think we've talked about stimulation with cats and dogs, haven't we, and how they need to be mentally and physically stimulated. But actually, we mustn't forget that these small caged animals need it as well. So actually,
they really do.
Being stuck in a cage all day without anything to do is mind-numbingly boring.
If you think that how we would feel, it is like being a prisoner with no stimulation. So it's really important, whatever pet you get, that they do get that stimulation.
And important to think about where you're getting them from. I know we'll talk a little bit about this earlier, but actually, if these small furry animals haven't been well socialised and handled as babies and young, then actually they're going to be less tolerant of being handled, aren't they? So they therefore then don't make really good children's pets if that's what you want, is an animal that they can handle. So it is really taking care of where you get them from as well, and asking what's the process been to actually get them well handled before you've acquired them.
I think that's the thing, and it's, we talk about that with dogs and cats, about socialisation, but it's really important for everything like rabbits and ferrets and all the other species, that if they're not handled when they're young, then they'll always be fearful of it. So it's really worth asking, and sometimes it is better to get them from someone who's sort of bred them at home and handled them a lot than perhaps going to a pet shop. Yeah. It depends on the pet shop, but definitely ask those questions.
It just reminded me, we had mice as children as well, and they escaped and they were never seen again.
Oh, no.
So also ensuring that you've got good places to keep these, good housing, so actually they can't escape, because actually that's really stressful for the animals as well if they've escaped.
Really stressful. Now actually, another group that we're going to talk about very briefly is fish. And actually, I think really in terms of actual numbers, there's more fish than any other pet. Because often people have quite a lot in a tank.
Yeah, I suppose,
So I can't remember what the number is. It's estimated at all sorts of things, but it's something like 100 million or something over the whole country of pet fish. Fish is something I would say, well, I certainly don't no masses about fish. We weren't really taught very much at vet school. We were taught a little bit about fish farming and that side of things, and diseases of salmon.
We were even taught about fish farming.
We had a trip to a fish farm, but obviously that's very different from pet fish, and it's really important to do some research and find somebody who's knowledgeable. I mean, some people who work at aquaria are quite knowledgeable. There's all sorts of different setups, whether it's freshwater or tropical or marine. And it's really important that you have good things like temperature control and water testing for sort of acidity and all sorts of other things. Nitrates, really, is it that you test for?
Yeah,
this shows
really
how
complicated
we don't
to me,
know
but
very much about fish. And obviously, if you've got something like a tropical tank, which means it has to be heated, you have to think about what am I going to do if there's a power cut or, that sort of thing. So I would say it's something where you really need to do lots of research and think about what species you have and what species you're having together, because sometimes people buy them and then one species eats the other.
Yeah, I was just going to say that.
Or they reproduce a lot.
Yeah. Actually, if they reproduce a lot, what do you then do with the offspring that you've got? So I know certainly you can return them sometimes back to the aquarium where they've come from. They will buy them back from you or take them, but yeah.
And it can be quite costly with all the heating, can't it, as well? So, again, it's something to really think about and do research. The next one that I was thinking about is birds, and I think birds is definitely one of those species or group of species where I would question personally, is it right to keep caged birds?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Is it right? And actually, should a species that is supposed to fly, should they be kept in a cage where a lot of the time they can't fly? So if we're thinking about smaller cages where budgies and the like are kept, then actually, should we be keeping them? But certainly if we are, surely it would be better if we've got proper aviaries, much more space so they can fly.
You've got to really allow them to fly properly. And I think, and okay, you might let them out sometimes around your lounge or whatever, but often that's only for a really short period, so it's only a tiny part of the day. And sometimes, obviously, in the past, things like parrots have had their wings clipped. And actually, just imagine if you're a species that flies and you suddenly find you can't because your wings have been clipped. I think that's quite poor welfare. And some of these species, particularly the parrots, but even like, parakeets and cockatiels can live a long time, can't they? So you've got to think, what would it be like to just be living for 80, 90 years or whatever, in a cage. So I think we've really got to think about birds. Obviously there are other birds, like people keeping hens, and more people keep hens, and sometimes they're rescued battery hens, or they're having a little bit more of a sort of hopefully natural life scratching around in people's gardens, or pigeons, where I suppose they sometimes have them in cages, but sometimes they're going off and at least having some free flying, aren't they, if they're racing pigeons. And they do need specialist care. Again, we didn't learn masses about pet birds. We learned quite a lot about chickens, but we didn't really learn very much about that. So sometimes you need to go to a specialist vet for some of these.
Yeah, and I think it's like with the fish as well, and we've talked about actually if they need vet care, it's if you're thinking of getting them, find out before you get them, where would I be able to go and either take the animal to or seek advice from a vet, because actually it might not be a local vet who's got all the knowledge. And I think you're used to, with your own health, if you go and see a GP, you might be referred on to see a specialist, but actually in the animal world I think there's a bit more reliance that vets are general practitioners that know everything, but actually when we come to these more exotic species, actually we don't know that much as general practitioners. Some vets do, I'm not going to say we don't, but the majority of us don't. We might know the basic health care that we can provide, but actually it might be that you need to go and see a specialist.
Yeah, definitely, because to be honest, there is so much to learn as a vet, And there's more and more research coming out all the time, which is great. But to actually know everything about every species now is really difficult, and people tend to be a little bit more concentrating on certain species or certain body systems or whatever. So I think particularly if you've got things like fish, birds, or we're going to mention reptiles and other exotics in a minute, you will probably have to go to a specialist vet, and that's certainly something that we would advise. So what about reptiles? What do you think? Again, yes. I have my...
Yeah, I have my views, but again, I think we might want to leave our views for another podcast. Maybe it'd be a good one. Let's talk about reptiles. There's some contentious feelings probably around it, around keeping them.
Yeah.
In terms of if you are keeping them, that the setup that you need is really key. That you ensure that you get your lighting, your temperature, using UV lights where you need to. And actually, and I've heard stories during this, like with cost of living problems that we've got at the moment. Actually, people can't afford to run their UV lights. So thinking about that long term, can you afford the electricity to be able to run them? So these animals, a lot of them need it. Without, they will suffer from deficiencies and health problems. So it's really key.
And certainly when I was in practice, I think pretty much every reptile that I saw, the problem was related to poor husbandry. That they weren't getting the right diet, or they weren't getting the right light, or they didn't have the right temperature. And every species, not all lizards are the same, not all snakes are the same. You've really got to know what you're doing, and I think it is quite difficult to look after them well. And I've seen ones that haven't eaten for months because they were given the wrong food, or they get problems with their bone density, all sorts of things. So I think, again, you really have to know what you're doing. And I think, yes, perhaps another time we'll have a bit more discussion about the whole thing about reptiles and other more exotic animals.
Thinking about reptiles, and also thinking about the food. So are you prepared to be feeding them locusts, etc.? You're prepared to feed some snakes, dead mice, etc. Dead chicks.
Yeah.
And, are you happy to be doing that? Because if you're not going to be, then that's certainly not the right animal for you.
Yeah.
So.
And with some exotic pets, and some that potentially might be dangerous, you do need actually a license to keep them.
You do.
We certainly wouldn't advise anyone to get anything really exotic like a lion or a tiger or anything like that. But, you have to look into all these things.
And the licenses are there for good reason.
Yeah, they are.
That's the thing. It's not just the law being difficult. It's for good reasons for both the animal's welfare, but also human safety as well.
Absolutely, and you do have to think, if you've got an animal that potentially is dangerous, you are responsible for it if it escapes and causes issues. And
so are we going to be talking about larger species, Maggie? So we've talked about all the domestic and potentially non-domestic reptiles, etc. But what about horses?
Well, obviously
pigs?
There are so many different species that people keep now. They keep pet pigs or horses, alpacas are becoming quite popular. To be honest, I don't think we've got time to cover all those in details, but obviously you need to have access usually to fields if you're going to keep them. Or horses, you have to pay for them to be stabled and looked after if you're not going to do it yourself. So I think... and the cost is obviously a lot higher as well. So again, it's something you'd really, really need to research.
I was thinking about pygmy goats then for some reason. That came into my mind. Pygmy goats.
Well,
there's a bit of a craze for pygmy goats, isn't there?
Goat yoga. Which again, I think at some point we'll have to talk about the use of animals in things like cafes and yoga classes and how good or bad that is for animal welfare. But
that was just the reason I was thinking about it. I was thinking, if you're going to get a small animal, because I know people often go get these small pigs, the micro pigs. There's a bit of a craze for micro pigs, wasn't there? And actually, unfortunately, they then turn out to be big pigs. So they actually don't end up being micro pigs. So you get a bit of a shock when 12 months down the line.
Yeah, when they're a piglet, they're micro, and they turn out to be a massive pot-bellied pig or something. So, again, you really need to think if you're going to go into that. But I think that's A whole another podcast. And obviously then once you've decided the species, you have to think about breed, and there is so much to think about with that, particularly I think with dogs. So we're not going to touch on everything today, but I think generally when you're thinking about breed, it's things like how active is this particular breed, hair length, if you've got a long haired anything really.
It could be a rabbit,
it could be a rabbit, could be cat. The number of Persian cats or other long-haired cats that as vets we've had to knock out with an anaesthetic and demat because people couldn't cope with a coat. What were their original purpose? I mean, each dog breed was selectively bred for certain duties, I suppose, in terms of being herding dogs or guard dogs or whatever. And they don't just lose that overnight because we're calling them a pet, do they? Health issues with different breeds.
Yeah. And not getting an animal just because it's fashionable.
Oh, no.
So we've seen the pop stars, the celebs out there acquiring certain breeds. And actually, just because it's fashionable doesn't mean they're the right animal for you. So it's actually, as we go back to what we talked about right at the beginning of the podcast, about getting the information about which animal is the right animal for you and will suit your lifestyle, etc. So, yeah, let's not just go with the fashions, because we certainly see trends of dog breeds, haven't we? And cat breeds as well, actually, what people are acquiring based on actually what celebs, etc. have got.
And that can be really quite detrimental, particularly thinking about like very flat-faced animals and things like that. So it's really important to research that. And then obviously you have to think, are you going to get a young animal, a puppy, a kitten, a rabbit kit or whatever, or are you going to get an adult? You could rescue or you could buy. There's pros and cons to both, really, I think.
I think that's probably where we can carry on next time, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Let's talk about, because again, where do we therefore go to acquire these animals?
Where do we get them and how do we prepare for their arrival?
Yeah.
So anyway, I hope that's given you food for thought, and we'll continue talking about this topic next time.
Until next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
And goodbye.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Vet Stalking Pets with Dr. Maggie Roberts and Dr. Vanessa Howie. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at info@advovet.co.uk. And please join us again for our next episode. Your pets will thank you.